All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, whenever you watch this. So, taking a little break from work. I'm trying to do a little bit of an escape here because I have a lot of stuff I got to do. But I figured I'd get some practice in, right? Teach or practice learning by teaching, rather, and hopefully get a little bit of a deeper understanding on OP myself. So, one thing I wanted to kind of go over is something that I've recently added to my version of the OP checklist. I call it the linear versus circular checklist. I've created an entire section on tidal waves, right? Because I think that's a very important thing to not only see in other people when you're typing them, but also just see in yourself, right? And hopefully you can reduce the amount of life problems you have, or at least just see when you're in the middle of a tidal wave. Now, I've made a video in the past where I kind of define or describe kind of the abstract way that tidal waves are caused, right? But I realized as I was making this page on my new checklist that Dave and Shan don't exactly have an official definition of tidal waves anywhere. I at least that I've not seen, right? I know I'm sleep last, maybe it's in some information I haven't seen yet, but at least for me, I didn't see it anywhere. And so what I ended up doing was I took a bunch of Q&As that had something to do with the tidal wave. I basically searched tidal wave in the website. And I basically created a definition of my own. And I do think that this kind of summarizes different aspects of the tidal waves that Dave and Shan say. Because one thing they'll do is they'll talk about one aspect of the tidal wave in one Q&A, and they'll talk about another aspect as if they're two different definitions. But I do think it's the same definition. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. I will add this into the description when I'm done, but this is basically page 2 of my checklist. So you got to scroll down a little bit. I don't know why there's so much empty space here, but regardless, you got to scroll down and then you'll have it starting here, okay? So starting off, this is a screenshot from the Doing the Work of the Last Animal Q&A that Dave and Shan have made, I think about a month ago. And this, they didn't talk about it in the context of tidal waves, but I believe that this is actually their best summary of what a tidal wave is. So what my definition is of a tidal wave is a large amount of real life problems that hit a person all at once because that person put off or avoided their last animal in tiny ways for a large amount of time. And that amount of problems leads to intense tantrums and freakouts from that person where they blame their last function for their quote unquote unfair life problems. Okay. And the reason why I worded it the way that I did is because in this Q&A, they really summarize it well. They talk about how everyone is triggered by their last function. So for example, I'll use myself. For example, I'm an ENFP jumper, but that means that I'm SI last. So whenever I'm hit with all of my life problems, I tend to blame it on, oh my gosh, this is so arbitrary. Why do I have to do all these stupid forms? Why do I have to do all this stupid paperwork? Why do I have to be the one in control over this? Can't people get control of themselves and leave me alone, right? So for me, I get very triggered by anything related to physical control, SI, control over the physical reality. Okay. Now, what Dave and Shan say, though, is that it's not, your problems are not coming from your last animal or your last function or the negativity that you put there, right? Because one thing that they say in this Q&A is that people will blame their last function for everything, right? And, even if that's nothing, it has nothing to do with what's wrong, right? So for example, for me, going back to, I'll use myself. It's like, at work, it's like all this paperwork and all this random admin stuff. Why do I have to deal with this? This isn't fair. Like, I should just be free to, do whatever I want at work and just don't make me do all this admin stuff, right? That's something I complain about a lot. So that would be an example of me blaming my SI, even though that probably isn't the problem. And then the second part of the tidal wave, which is more at the front, is all these life problems are coming because the person avoided their last animal, right? So as they say here, you're not putting enough time into the last animal. So again, using myself, so I am an infodom with sleep last, which means that I'm overworking the information. I'm oversharing information. I'm over gathering information because I am afraid to go back over known information. Okay. And I'm also afraid of preserving energy. Now, what does that look like in practice? So I'll use my life right now, right? So like I said, at work, there are a lot of these arbitrary things that piss me off and that I avoid and I don't want to do, and they feel overwhelming and there's too much of it. But when I take a step back, if I were to trust the math, as it were, here, and be like, okay, well, what's actually going on? One is that I have not put enough systems in place at work so that I can preserve energy. I haven't put in some automatic, whether it's auto replies or, ways to delegate certain tasks. I have not put those systems in place so that I can relax, so that I can take more breaks and trust the system in the background, right? And then on top of that, sleep, going over known information. A lot of times, and this is me being honest with you guys, a lot of times I make mistakes because either I don't go over the conversation I had with that client or with a customer, or because I don't go over certain things related to even putting in the paperwork. I don't review the instructions, so then I'll file it wrong and that'll waste more of my time and more of their time. I don't, I have a bad habit of not fully going through my emails consistently, so that leads to a lot of bottlenecks, and that leads to that pile up, right? That would lead to that tidal wave and so on. So I'm using myself, this is going to be different for you if you're a different type than me, but that's kind of where the tidal wave comes from, right? So but understand, these are real life problems. So when people are freaking out in their tidal waves, it's kind of legit in the sense of they're not making it up. They are getting hit by real things, but they're mistaking it as the world is unfair because of their last function, but really it's coming from them avoiding that last animal in really, really tiny ways. And one thing that I guess I need to emphasize here as well is that one thing that Dave and Shannon talk about a lot is that even though people get extremely triggered by their last function and blame it for everything, or blame every problem they have on their last function, they kind of talk about the last animal as it's almost like you're insensitive to how bad you are at it, right? They talk about how you can have thousands of problems piling up in your life because of your last animal, but you will always feel like you're fine in that area. So for example, let's use myself again. If you were to, and this is true throughout my life, right? If you were to come to me and say, hey, Reggie, you need to take a break, you need to stop and go over, all the stuff at work and deal with all the stuff that's piling up at work, I'd be like, yeah, I'll get to that later. Let me first try and do more. That'd be kind of my biggest excuse. I would stay at work late. I would stay in the office late and I wouldn't be productive because I wouldn't actually address the problems that were piling up. I would just be like calling more or trying to make up a new NT understanding or a new NT plan at work and things like that. And for me, that's how I would usually escape that last animal, because I didn't feel like I had to, preserve energy. I didn't feel like I had to put any systems in place to protect myself and things like that, right? So that's kind of the summary of what a tidal wave is. I did include several hyperlinks for you guys to reference because I do think they talk about it in small ways a lot. So for example, doing the work of the last animals, the source of this screenshot, I think this is probably the best place where they define a tidal wave without saying the word tidal wave. It was kind of confusing as to why they don't do that, but regardless, I do think this is the best place. There's another Q&A called Dealing with Other People's Tidal Waves, where they describe the tidal wave as a childish tantrumy state and a freak out. And I do think that's part of the tidal wave, but that's not everything, because in this Q&A they don't describe why they're freaking out, whereas I feel like my definition explains why. And then there's, some things related to atomic habits, my own interpretations and things like that. One other thing I'm going to start working on is they have several Q&As, one where they talk about how to solve tidal waves, right? Putting work into your last animal, and then finding alphas that have different saviors than you, so that whenever you follow their advice, you're basically taking responsibility for their saviors whenever you follow their advice, right? So for them, they say, what would Tony Robbins do? For me, that would be something like, what would David Allen do? He's play last. What would James Clear do? He's blast sleep, right? So that's how I do it. And you would have to basically find alphas that would work for you, just to make that shortcut. And then they also have a Q&A about how to distill drama. I think this was very important, but I need to break that down in a later video maybe. And then finally, they have several Q&As about specific tidal waves based on your human needs, your temperaments, and things like that. So for example, they have quite a few Q&As about the IP tidal wave that I would recommend you look into, Demon NT tidal waves, Demon SF tidal waves, Demon NF tidal waves. I don't know if they have Demon ST tidal waves anywhere. But I mean, you could basically infer it. But and then consume last tidal waves. I think they also have sleep last somewhere in there. So I have all of that in this checklist. I'll put it in the description, like I said. But if you're skipping around, I know some of you guys just skip to the end. Think of your tidal waves as your tidal waves are your fault. right? It's not because life is unfair. It's not because your last function is unfair to you, and because you think that everything is conspiring against you. That's not what's happening, right? The more you blame, the more you're blaming your last function, and whether you know it or not, right? Every time you get triggered or annoyed, that's coming from your last function. But all those life problems that are hitting you and that feel so unfair is because you aren't doing that last animal, and really because you don't feel like your last animal is a problem. That's kind of the source of the issue, right? So really the solution is you have to trust the math. I'm probably going to write that in here. You have to trust that Dave and Shan are telling you the truth about this, right? Because otherwise you're never going to feel like doing your last animal ever, right? Because like they said, it's like it's almost like a deficiency. You can't feel it. So do the work of your last animal, even if you don't feel like that's where your problems are coming from. Stop blaming the world for your unfair life, because that's you just blaming your last function indirectly or unconsciously. And as you put in time to your last animal, also pick some alphas that you admire who have different saviors than you, and follow their advice so that you basically can take a shortcut into doing their saviors as well, okay? That's about it. I'm about to go back to work. I just figured I would, practice teaching here. If you have any questions, comments, or if you're going through a tidal wave, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk to you about that. I do also have a snug where, several people now are talking to me about, things in their life, and I try and listen at least and help where I can. So if you do want to have that kind of quality time, feel free to sign up for that. Other than that, I'm going to head out. I hope you guys have a great day. Have a great weekend. And I will see you in the next video that I make. Take care.